We're making an emergency landing. The captain's voice echoed to the cabin of Flight 892 as both engines failed at 31,000 feet. The passengers on board sat frozen in disbelief as the aircraft shuddered. But when the quiet passenger in seat 12C stood up to help, no one could have anticipated what would happen next. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Tales Unveiled. Let's dive right into this incredible story. Captain Janet Bradley had been flying commercial aircraft for over 12 years, yet nothing could prepare her for noise that suddenly filled the cockpit at 31,000 feet. The Boeing 737 shuddered violently as warning lights flooded the panel like an angry Christmas tree. What the hell was that? First Officer Derek Walsh's voice cracked as he tightly gripped the controls. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Janet's voice was calm, though every word was weighed down with gravity. We're experiencing a mechanical issue, and we will be making an emergency landing in Denver. Please remain seated and follow all crew instructions. What she didn't mention to the 147 passengers on board was the extent of the danger. Not only had they just lost their primary hydraulic system, but the starboard engine was now showing temperature spikes that indicated might soon follow the first engine into failure. In seat 12C, retired Air Force Colonel Glenn Hartwell slowly closed his well-worn paperback novel. At 71, Glenn had seen it all, enough to recognize the difference between routine turbulence and something far more serious. The plane's violent shudder, the captain's measured tone. This was no ordinary problem. The way the aircraft was rattling, the unusual angle they were at, he could tell they were in real trouble. Glenn glanced out the window. They were flying over the Rocky Mountains. Jagged peaks stretched below them. It was beautiful country, but dangerous for a plane in distress. 3 rows ahead, Diane Carpenter clutched her daughter Emma's hand. It was Emma's first flight, a birthday trip to see her grandparents in Denver. But now, the child's eyes were wide with fear as murmurs of concern rippled through the cabin. "Mommy, what's happening?" Emma whispered. "Just a little airplane hiccup, baby. The pilot knows what she's doing." Diane tried to reassure her daughter, though she didn't feel confident herself. The vibrations were getting worse. The plane's movements fell off. Something wasn't right. In the cockpit, Janet's training was quickly being pushed to its limits. The starboard engine temperature was soaring past safe levels, and hydraulic pressure was rapidly depleting. Without hydraulics, controlling the massive aircraft was becoming nearly impossible. Derek's voice was steady, but tinged with resignation as he reported their worsening situation. "We're not going to make it to Denver." Janet knew he was right. They were still 100 miles out, steadily losing altitude, and the controls were becoming less responsive by the minute. Through her headset, she heard air traffic control directing other planes away from their flight path, clearing airspace for what was expected to be a crash zone. "Flight 892, we have dual engine failure, total hydraulic loss. We're not going to make it to the airport." Janet spoke into the mic, her words heavy. The weight of them hit like a death sentence. "Flight 892, roger. Emergency crews are standing by. There's a small regional airport at Pine Valley, bearing 270 degrees, 15 miles. Runway 09-27 for 1,800 feet. Janet's heart sank. For 1,800 feet. A Boeing 737 needed at least 6,000 feet to land safely under normal conditions. With no engines and failing hydraulics, the runway might as well have been a postage stamp. It was at this moment that a knock came on the cockpit door. "Captain," a calm voice said, "I'm Colonel Glenn Hartwell, retired Air Force. I'd like to help." Janet glanced at Derek, who simply shrugged. They were running out of options fast. "Come in," Janet replied. Glenn Hartwell stepped into the cockpit. At once, Janet noticed his commanding presence. He was tall, silver-haired, and exuded a steady confidence that suggested he had faced far worse situations in the past. His eyes quickly scanned the instruments, taking the catastrophic readings with the practiced ease of someone who has spent a lifetime navigating aircraft systems. "How long since you lost the engines?" Glenn asked, his tone measured. "Port engine failed 8 minutes ago. Starboard is running hot and losing power." Janet replied. Glenn nodded. "Hydraulics failing. We got maybe 20% left. I flew F-4 Phantoms in Vietnam, then test aircraft for 30 years after that. He said quietly, I've dead stick jets before, but nothing this heavy. May I? Janet hesitated. Her training screamed that passengers had no place in the cockpit, no matter their qualifications. But her gut told her that normal rules didn't apply when they were dealing with the aftermath of an engine failure. Take the jump seat, she finally said. Glenn strapped himself in and immediately started analyzing the situation. Pine Valley's got a short runway, but it has something better, a natural backstop at the base of a mountain. If we overshoot, we'll hit the mountain, but at least we'll stop. If we overshoot, we die, Derek said flatly. If we don't try, we definitely die, Glenn replied, his voice calm. Janet, you need to think like a glider pilot now, Glenn continued. We've got one shot at this. No go-arounds, no second chances. In the cabin, flight attendant Carol Williams was doing her best to maintain order as the passengers began to panic. The plane was clearly in distress. The vibrations were intensifying, and they were losing altitude with every passing second. The murmurs of anxiety were quickly turning into full-blown fear. Ladies and gentlemen, please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and your seatbacks are in the upright position. Carol's voice came through the intercom. She tried to keep her tone professional, but her heart was racing. The passengers were getting restless. Some were starting to cry. Others were whispering prayers. And in the back of the plane, some were screaming. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Glenn's presence had begun to change the atmosphere. Janet felt her nerves settling as she drew strength from his calm confidence, though a part of her still screamed that this wasn't how it was supposed to be. A passenger in the cockpit? This wasn't the protocol. But everything in her gut told her the normal rules no longer applied. There was too much at stake. We need to lose weight and altitude fast, Glenn said, studying the fuel gauges. The weight of the fuel was becoming a hindrance. All that fuel is just dead weight now. Janet hesitated. Every single bit of her training told her not to dump fuel with engines out, especially with a plane this size. But 12 years of training hadn't prepared her for this moment. Janet, Glenn's voice cut through her hesitation, gentle but firm. Every pound of fuel we're carrying makes this harder. The people back there are counting on us to make the hard choices. Janet looked at the passengers in the cabin through the small cockpit window. She thought about Diane and Emma, just 3 rows behind the cockpit door. She thought about the businessman who had been rude to the flight attendant, the elderly couple in row 15 holding hands. All of them trusted her to bring them home. Her hands shook as she reached for the fuel dump switches. This goes against everything I've ever been taught, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Sometimes survival does, Glenn replied. She took a deep breath, and for a split second, everything seemed to freeze in time. But then she reached for the switches. The moment felt surreal, like they were no longer pilots, but survivors trying to decide how they'd land. Outside, passengers watched in bewilderment as streams of fuel poured from the wings, creating vapor trails behind the aircraft. In seat 12C, Emma clutched her mother's hand tighter, her eyes wide as she saw the fuel leaking from the wings. Mom, why is the plane leaking? Emma asked, her voice trembling. Sarah didn't have an answer. She simply pulled her daughter close, tried to recall the crash position they had demonstrated during the safety briefing. Back in the cockpit, Glenn was guiding Janet through an approach that would have been challenging even for a small aircraft, let alone a commercial jet. Pine Valley Airport was a tiny strip in the mountains, primarily used by private planes and small cargo flights. The runway was short and narrow, surrounded by towering peaks that could easily snag the aircraft and send it crashing into the rocky terrain. There, Glenn pointed out the windscreen. 2 o'clock, about 8 miles. Janet looked. There was a thin line of asphalt carved into the side of the mountain like a scar. It seemed impossibly small from their altitude, but it was their only option. Approach control, Flight 892, Janet called into the radio, her voice steady despite the chaos. We have the airport in sight. 892, you're cleared for any runway, any approach, came the reply from approach control. Emergency crews are standing by. What approach control didn't say was that the fire trucks and ambulances were stationed well away from the runway. Everyone on the ground knew this was likely going to be a recovery operation, not a rescue. Glenn's eyes were calculating, doing the mental math that had kept him alive in countless test flights. "We're coming in too fast and too high," he said, his voice calm, even though the situation was anything but. "We need to slip her." Janet's heart skipped a beat. A slip in a Boeing 737 was almost unthinkable. It was a maneuver designed for small aircraft, where the pilot deliberately uncoordinates the controls to create drag and lose altitude quickly. But in a commercial jet, it could easily result in a stall and an immediate crash. "I can't do that," Janet whispered. "If I get this wrong, everyone dies." "Look at me," Glenn's voice cut through her panic. "Everyone's already going to die if we don't try this. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to trust yourself. You've got the skills. You just need the courage." Janet closed her eyes for a split second. She thought of Emma's frightened face, of all the families who would never see their loved ones again if she failed. When she opened her eyes, her hands were steadier. "Left rudder, right aileron," she said softly, more to herself than to Glenn. "That's it. Trust the physics." With a deep breath, Janet pushed the aircraft into a slip. The Boeing groaned and shuddered, every warning system in the cockpit screaming in protest. For a terrifying moment, she thought they were going to stall and spiral into the mountains. But to her relief, it worked. They were losing altitude and speed rapidly, the mountain runway now growing larger in their windscreen. "Beautiful," Glenn said quietly. "Now straighten her out. We're committed." The word committed hit Janet like a physical blow. There was no turning back now. No second chances. This landing would either save 147 lives or end them all. The runway rushed up to meet them faster than anything Janet had ever experienced. The emergency vehicles lined up on either side, their flashing lights like a surreal parade. The mountain peaks loomed on either side, so close that she felt like she could reach out and touch them. "Air speed 180, Derek called out. Too fast. They needed to be going 140 for landing, but they were running out of runway and altitude to slow down. "Hold steady," Glenn said, his voice steady despite the mounting pressure. "Let her settle. Let her settle." The runway threshold flashed beneath them, closer now than anything Janet had ever experienced. The flashing lights of emergency vehicles streaked in the corner of her vision, their sirens now a distant, constant hum. The mountain peaks on either side of them felt almost suffocatingly close, so close that it felt like she could reach out and touch them. This was it. There would be no second chances. Janet pulled back on the yoke, desperately trying to flare the aircraft and soften the landing. But with the minimal hydraulics remaining, the controls barely responded. Every muscle in her body strained against the weight of the situation as the aircraft hurtled down the runway at more than 180 knots. The plane wasn't slowing down. In fact, it felt like it was speeding up. "Hold steady, Janet," Glenn urged. "We're coming in hot, but you've got this." Despite the tension, the world outside felt strangely still, as if the universe itself were holding its breath. Janet fought to control her panic, focusing every ounce of energy on the task at hand. They were too fast. There was no denying it. The end of the runway was coming at them quickly, and beyond it lay the steep, unforgiving mountain slope. With minimal braking power and no reverse thrust, it was a race against time, and the finish line was closing in fast. "Hold it, hold it." Glenn's calm voice was the only thing keeping her tethered to reality. "Let her settle." The aircraft's wheels finally made contact with the runway. The plane hit hard, harder than anything Janet had ever felt in her career. The shock waves reverberated through the fuselage, and the force sent her forward against her seatbelt, her body trembling with the impact. Every passenger in the cabin was thrown forward, their seatbelts the only thing holding them in place. But they were down. Now came the most critical part: stopping. The Boeing 737 was still traveling at over 100 miles per hour, and they were rapidly running out of runway. There was no engine power to help slow them down. Janet's heart was racing in sync with the wheels screaming against the tarmac. the aircraft groaning in protest as she slammed her feet against the brake pedals. But the brakes weren't enough. The plane was still hurtling toward the end of the runway. "Brace for impact," Janet shouted over the intercom. The warning echoed through the cabin as every passenger braced for the worst. The emergency crews watching from the sides could only hope they were about to witness a miracle. Then, in a move that would make any aviation expert's blood run cold, Glenn Hartwell did something that went against all protocols. He reached across and grabbed the emergency brake handle. It was a last-ditch effort. This system was meant only for ground operations, not for aircraft traveling at speed. But Glenn knew they were running out of time. With no other options, he pulled the handle. The plane lurched violently as the emergency brakes engaged. Passengers screamed as they were thrown forward, the violent deceleration causing their seatbelts to dig into their bodies. The aircraft finally started to slow, but the end of the runway was still too close. They were just 50 feet from the cliff-like drop. The wheels locked up, screeching in protest, the tires smoking as they desperately fought to slow the plane down. Janet pushed harder on the brake pedals, her entire body tense, every muscle screaming in resistance as she did everything she could to stop the aircraft in time. And then, just as the edge of the runway loomed beneath them, the Boeing 737 came to a stop. For a moment, everything was silent. The cockpit was eerily still. Only the sound of cooling metal and the distant wail of approaching sirens could be heard. The weight of the situation settled in. But for the first time in what felt like forever, Janet allowed herself to breathe. And then, over the intercom, flight attendant Carol's voice rang out, breaking the silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Pine Valley, Colorado. Please remain seated while we prepare for evacuation." Glenn remained in his seat, staring out the cockpit window at the emergency crews swarming the aircraft. Despite the tense moment, he felt a strange sense of calm. It was over, but one thing was still bugging him. The man who had just helped save 147 lives. This stranger, who was he really? Who was the man who had come out of nowhere to help them land the plane? Glenn looked at the emergency crews, who were now preparing to assist with the evacuation. Among them was a tall figure standing near an ambulance, his sharp jawline and steady eyes unmistakable. It was someone Glenn hadn't seen in 5 long years. It was his son, Commander Russell Hartwell. The evacuation process was quick, less than 10 minutes. No one had been seriously hurt, no fatalities. It was being hailed as a miracle on the evening news, but Glenn knew better. It wasn't a miracle. It was experience. It was physics. And it was a little bit of luck. As Glenn descended the emergency slide, he saw Russell waiting for him at the bottom. "Dad," Russell said, his voice quiet, betraying the emotion he had kept bottled up for so long. "Son," Glenn replied, the two of them standing there, facing each other for the first time in years. The tension between them was palpable. But in this moment, it felt like a lifetime's worth of words had been unsaid. "I heard what you did up there," Russell said, his voice cracking slightly. "The whole crew is talking about it." Glenn shrugged it off. "I just helped the pilot. She did all the real work." But Russell wasn't listening. "Dad, I've been trying to reach you for months. About Mom's anniversary. About the ceremony. About a lot of things. I've been an idiot." Glenn felt something break inside of him. Something he'd been holding on to for 5 long years. "We both been idiots, son." And then the embrace came. It wasn't just a father and son reconnecting. It was a moment of healing, of reconciliation, witnessed by news cameras. That hug, the reunion of a father and son, would later come to symbolize the Pine Valley miracle. It wasn't the dramatic landing that defined it, but the moment these two men found their way back to each other. Janet Bradley was lauded for her skill under extreme pressure. The story of Flight 892's emergency landing spread across news outlets worldwide, and she received praise for keeping calm when everything seemed to be falling apart. But Janet was never comfortable in the spotlight. Every time someone called her a hero, she thought of Glenn Hartwell, the man who had walked into the cockpit when she needed him most. She knew the real hero was a stranger who had stepped up when no one else could. For Glenn, it was a different story. He deflected the attention with the same humility he had carried with him through a lifetime of service. To him, it wasn't about being praised. It was about doing what needed to be done. Helping the crew land that plane had been an opportunity to use the skills he had honed over decades. It was, in his words, a second chance to do something right. In the days that followed, the media were filled with stories about the miracle landing at Pine Valley, but Glenn wasn't interested in the press. He didn't need the recognition. He was just glad he had been in the right place at the right time. Sometimes, he thought, life didn't hand you a second chance to make things right. But when it did, you had to seize it. As the months passed, Glenn went back to his routine, but the events of that day stayed with him. It wasn't just a physical act of saving the flight that lingered in his mind. It was the way the world had suddenly come full circle for him. When the emergency had unfolded, he had been just another passenger. And then, in that critical moment, he had become part of the solution. It reminded him that sometimes you were called to action in the most unexpected ways. Then, 6 months later, Glenn received an invitation to speak at the Air Force Academy graduation. It was an honor, a recognition of his long service in both the military and aviation. But it wasn't just a speech that brought Glenn back into the public eye. It was the fact that his grandson, Russell's son, was among the cadets graduating that day. As Glenn stood in front of the audience at the Air Force Academy, looking out at the young faces before him, he thought about second chances. The second chance he had gotten that day in the cockpit, when his expertise had made the difference between life and death. But more than that, he thought about the second chance he had with his son, Russell, the chance to finally repair the rift between them. His eyes fell on his grandson, who was about to receive his wings. A wave of emotion washed over him. Here was a young man, standing at the threshold of a career in the military, following in the footsteps of generations before him. Glenn thought back to his own days as a young cadet, full of ambition and ideals. But life wasn't always about the missions you planned for. Sometimes it was about the unexpected moments that came your way, the moments that changed everything. That's what Glenn had learned. Sometimes life didn't give you a choice. You didn't choose when to be a hero. You simply responded to the need when it was placed in front of you at the graduation ceremony. Glenn's thoughts wandered back to the day of the emergency landing. He thought about the fear he had seen in the eyes of the passengers, the way their trust had been placed in the hands of the crew. And in that critical moment, when the aircraft was falling apart, Glenn had made the choice to step forward. He had recognized the opportunity to help, and he had taken it. As he stepped up to the podium to address the graduating class, Glenn's voice was steady, but there was an unmistakable warmth to it. He spoke not just about the importance of serving your country or the sacrifices that came with it, but about the importance of being there for the people who needed you when they needed you the most. The most important flights in life, he said, looking out at the young cadets, aren't always the ones you plan for. They're the ones that find you when you're needed most. The ones that test your mettle, your courage, and your ability to do the right thing, even when the odds are against you. He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. Sometimes, the person who steps up isn't the one you expect, he continued. It might be a retired Air Force colonel who's just sitting in the seat next to you. Or it might be someone you've never met before. But when that moment comes, when you're called to action, you'll know what to do. The words resonated in the room, and for a moment, Glenn felt like the entire room was holding its breath. It was as if, in that moment, everything had come full circle. He was speaking not just to the young cadets in front of him, but to himself. He had learned something in those 71 years of his life, that it's never too late to make a difference, and that sometimes the most important moments of your life come when you least expect them. As Glenn finished speaking, a wave of silence passed over the room. The cadets, the staff, and the audience were all caught up in the weight of his words. In that moment, it wasn't about the accolades or the speeches. It was about the lesson he had just shared. That sometimes life calls you to act when you least expect it, and that the most important flights aren't the ones you plan for. They're the ones that choose you. Glenn walked off the stage, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. As he stepped down into the crowd, he noticed his grandson, Russell's son, standing there, his uniform sharp and proud, ready to face the challenges ahead. Russell had made it. He had followed his own path, just like Glenn had. But it was more than just about the military service or the cadet's career. It was about the lessons that went beyond the uniform. Glenn had passed on the wisdom of a life lived in service, a life where duty to others was paramount. And he knew, just as a cadet class had learned, that no one really knows when their time to act will come. But when it does, you have to be ready. After the ceremony, as Glenn made his way toward the reception, his son Russell approached him, a soft smile on his face. "I never expected to see you here, Dad," he said. There was a slight hint of surprise in his voice, but there was something else, too. Something deeper. Glenn chuckled, a knowing look in his eyes. "You know, son, sometimes life surprises you. The important things are never planned, but you have to be open to them when they come your way." Russell nodded, understanding the weight of those words. The distance between them had closed over the past few months, ever since their emotional reunion after flight. They'd begun to rebuild a relationship that had been fractured for years. The time away from each other had been painful, but it had taught them both lessons they hadn't expected. "Dad, I just want to say thanks for everything," Russell said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not just for what you did on the plane, but for being here today, for showing me what it means to truly serve. I've been so wrapped up in my own life that I didn't realize how much I needed to hear your story." Glenn felt a lump form in his throat, his chest tight. For years, he had carried around the weight of their estrangement, but hearing those words from his son made everything seem lighter. "You've always been my pride, Russ. I'm just glad we're getting a second chance to be there for each other." They stood there for a moment, the silence between them no longer awkward but comfortable, filled with unspoken understanding. It was as if they had finally come to terms with their past and were ready to face the future together. The reception that followed was filled with laughter and conversation, but Glenn's mind kept drifting back to the emergency landing. He couldn't help but reflect on the lessons learned that day, the moments that had seemed like the end, but turned out to be the beginning. In a way, that flight had been a microcosm of life itself. You never know what's coming, but when it does, you have to make the best of it. Glenn smiled softly to himself, watching his son interact with the other cadets. His legacy was not just in the service he had given or the years spent flying jets. It was in the life lessons he had passed down to the next generation. It was in the way his actions, on and off the battlefield, had shaped the course of history, both professionally and personally. The media continued to call the emergency landing a miracle, but Glenn knew the truth. It wasn't a miracle. It was a combination of experience, instinct, and the simple courage to step up when it counted. It was a realization that when you are faced with a moment that demands everything from you, there's only one choice: to act, to rise to the occasion, no matter what the odds. As the evening wound down and the crowd slowly dispersed, Glenn stood with his family, content in a way he hadn't been for years. His son was on a path of his own now, one he had paved with his own hands, just as Glenn had. And though the events of that day, Flight 892, the dramatic emergency landing, the reunion with Russell, were still fresh in his mind, he couldn't help but feel that the real miracle wasn't in the landing. It was in the moments that followed, the moments where people made choices that would last a lifetime. The next day, as Glenn prepared to leave the Air Force Academy, he received a message. It was a thank you note from Janet Bradley, the pilot he had helped. She wrote that she would always be grateful for his presence that day and for his expertise. But she also said something that resonated deeply with him. "You didn't just save our lives, Glenn. You showed me that sometimes it's the unexpected heroes who make the biggest impact. You were exactly where you were meant to be. And I'll never forget that." The note made Glenn pause for a moment. He wasn't looking for praise, but he realized that sometimes it wasn't just the big acts that defined who we are. It was the little moments, those quiet acts of courage, that ultimately shaped the course of our lives. As Glenn left the academy, he knew one thing for certain. Sometimes the most important flights aren't the ones you plan for. Sometimes they find you when you least expect it. And when they do, you have to be ready to take the controls. And with that, the story of Flight 892, Glenn Hartwell, and the miracle on the runway came to an end. But the lessons learned that day, about second chances, courage, and the power of stepping up would stay with them all for the rest of their lives. Thank you for following this incredible journey. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more amazing tales. Also, be sure to check out the next video on your screen. You won't want to miss it. Until next time,